Hi, I'm Andrzej Kinastowski from Office Samurai. I want to show you today a feature that we started using recently, and we find it really helpful. So my goal is to show you how it can help you develop better code and how you can adjust it so it fits how you develop your bots and to reflect your best practices. This feature is workflow analyzer. And if you look into your studio, you see that there's an analyze project and there's a workflow analyzer settings. And let's have a look at the settings before we go into analyzing our bot. Here you can see there's quite a lot of rules that you get off the shelf with your studio. So some of those rules are pretty grave. So basically, if you look at there's no project JSON file or there's no main workflow, your automation will never be able to run without them. There are some others that can be as serious as those and not as easy to spot. For instance, an infinite loop. We found a workflow analyzer actually allowed us to find one potentially infinite loop in one of our automations. Or a variable overriding an argument. We did have a problem with putting together one of our bots. And the problem was tricky because each of the components, when we were testing them separately, was working completely fine. But when we put it together, it somehow didn't work. And we have run the workflow analyzer, and it immediately told us what the problem is. One of the developers left in one of the components a variable with exactly the same name as an out argument. A rookie mistake, probably all of us have done this, but what happens in such a situation is that inside a component, everything looks to be working well and your data gets written into what you think is an argument. But then it doesn't go out into the component that is invoking this one. So those are kind of checks or rules that check for really serious things. There are also other ones that are more about best practices. So they will not make your automation break, but they will make it less efficient or harder to maintain. A good example would be hard-coded timeout. So your bot will work if you do this, but one day when you have to slow your bot down because your system slowed down, you will have a lot more work if you hard code your timeouts as compared to putting the timeouts in your configuration files as you should. And also there's another class of rules that are more around how easy to read your code will be. How neatly is it done? How much work you have put into making it readable and easy to understand by other people. So we have things like empty workflows. We should not have those lying around because they clutter your code. Or we have ifs that are nested too deep. And you know that if you nest your ifs too deeply, then your sequences get very wide and they are way harder to analyze. So there's all kinds of rules here that you can check your project against. And to be honest, some of them we actually have decided not to use. If we look at the end, let's look at the blue ones first. Basically, there's a few rules that are in line with UiPath's best practices, but they are not in line with ours. So, for instance, variable naming and argument naming We do not use this rule where you would put in and out at the beginning of an argument name. So this is why this particular rule is switched off. Or there's a rule that says that you should be putting default values in your arguments. Actually, in our best practices, we have something completely different. We try to avoid default values as much as possible. And to test our components, we rather use especially prepared test files, and they are providing the arguments to the parts of code that we want to test. So some of them we have switched off, and let's have a look at what it can find in a project. And I have taken a project on purpose. I have taken a project that is old. We wrote it quite some time ago. And also it's a little bit different than other projects because it works on Citrix. And a Citrix where we were unable to install a Citrix plugin. So we do not have direct access to selectors. And because of that, we have to sometimes do things in a way that is not like 100% kosher, that basically in any other bot would not be accepted. So you can analyze your project here with from the menu, and it will immediately give you a list of things it thinks you should have a look at. And you can see there's a lot of those here. Majority of it is activity name default. So basically it says you have put an activity in your automation and you didn't change its name. And we all know that it's a best practice to change it. I mean, of course, I wouldn't, if somebody doesn't change the name of a log message, I probably wouldn't hold it against them. But for an if, for each row, for a sequence, absolutely the names should be changed. So those, somebody should have a look at those errors. Let's see what else we have here. Here we go. Deeply nested activities. Another one of those that keep your code clean and easy to read. If you nest your activities too deep, so an activity inside an activity and then a sequence and then another set of activities, if you nest too deeply, the code gets harder to read. Of course, sometimes we don't have that much choice, but probably those few cases, somebody should have a look at them, and maybe it is possible to clean those up. We also have errors for empty sequence. And absolutely, we shouldn't leave empty sequences in our code. But as you can see on the right here, those errors are in our test files. So those are the files that invoke actual components, giving them the arguments for us to be able to test them. So for tester files, I will disregard those errors because those test files, they will never be run in production. They are only there for development purposes. Hard-coded delay activity. This, as I said before, the delays and here also timeouts, we should be having them in the configuration file. Minimum log messages, this is a really interesting one. A lot of it is in the test file, so I would disregard them, but we do have some of those errors in actually in production files. And this basically means that you are not logging enough. Those should be, somebody should have a look at those, because if we do not do enough logging, then it will be way, way harder for us to maintain the bot and to see, in case of errors, to see what really happened. For me, the most interesting here are those with the secure string. And basically, what it found is something that in any other project would be a big no-no. So we're taking a credential from orchestrator, and of course, the password gets saved in a secure string variable, but then we're actually converting this secure string into a string. You should not be doing that in a project. In this particular project, we didn't really have a choice because, as I said, this is done in Citrix, where we do not have access to selectors, and we couldn't find any way to put a secure string in one of those windows. So we actually had to use the send hotkey command to send the password into the window we needed to send it to. So, as I said, any other project, this would absolutely have to be changed. In this particular one, we're going to have to let it slide. And also, it found an unused variable. This should be fixed. We shouldn't have stray variables lying around in our component. So as you can see, there's all different kinds of errors and warnings that this tool can show you. And the goal here is to give you pointers to how can I make my code better? How can I make it more robust? How can I make it more safe? And we've been using it for quite some time, and we like it a lot. It helped us a lot of times. But we also, at a certain point, started thinking, we have our own best practices. And actually, our best practices file is 16 pages long at this point in time. So this is a file that is that the whole team works on, and we add new things and we discuss it, and sometimes we change things or remove best practices. So this is a living document, and we started thinking, are there any things in here that we could test automatically? Because a lot of it you cannot, but some of them we thought could be made into those rules. And so the team put their heads together and they came up with a list of things that potentially could be implemented as rules in UiPath Studio. And one of the developers volunteered to prepare a package of our own rules. Let me show it to you in the studio. The ones that start with OS for Office Samurai and BPR for best practices, the ones in black, the 9, are our own rules that we have prepared and that we are using to make our code even better. So to briefly show you what could be put in such a custom rule, I told you that we have a different way of naming our variables and arguments. So in our case, what we do is we put the type of the variable or an argument at the beginning. So those two rules check for exactly that. We have a rule that every component has to start with a log and end with a log. And those logs have a very specific format that we are always following. We will be able to stop doing that with 21.4 because there's some neat things about invoke workflow that will replace this, but for now, it's there. In our best practices, the main sequence in a component needs to have exactly the same name as the component's name. Another rule for try-catch. So in the off-the-shelf rules, you have a rule that a catch cannot be empty. We added to that because in our best practices, in every catch, the first thing you do is you put a log, and it's a log in a very specific format. So this rule checks for that. References in AddQ items are mandatory for us. Ugly selectors, this is what we call selectors that either have IDX with a hard-coded number or are using CSS selectors. We really don't like those CSS selectors. And again, you have to remember that sometimes you will see a warning and you will disregard it because sometimes we do not have a choice. We have to use IDX, right? But if we can avoid them, we really try to. Arguments with default value, what I told you before, in our case, it's actually not advised to have arguments with default value because we did have cases where when moving the code to production, we didn't remove those default values, and some of this information should just shouldn't be there. And this is a pretty special one. There was a case of a new property being added in UI activities that is called alter if disabled. And if you use this new package from the very beginning of your project, when you use the activities, alter if disabled is switched off, and this is how it should be. But there was this strange thing where if you had a bot built on an old version of the package, and then you upgraded the package, then alter if disabled automatically would be set to true in those activities. And this caused us some trouble, so we built a rule to check against this. So how do you do this? How do you build your own rules? It's not as hard as some people may imagine, but it does require you to have a certain set of skills. So this developer of ours built them in C# in Visual Studio. And basically what the project consists of, those are the resources, so the data that we use throughout our inspection functions, with those recommendations that you get when you run a rule and their names and codes. So basically we put it here so it's easy to manage and maintain. And when it comes to the rules themselves, they're not as complicated as one may think they would. So if you look here, this would be the main part that is of interest to us. You see that we go through each activity, and for each activity, we go through each argument. And if the argument's name is alter if disabled, and it is set to true, then we create a warning message. So basically, we have a loop inside the loop and some ifs, and this way we find all the places where alter if disabled is set to true. It's more or less the same here. This is the rule for default values in arguments. So with a for each, we go through all the arguments, and then if the argument's value is not null, then we add a message saying this argument has a default value. So again, pretty straightforward. This one has a little bit more code. This is the one that looks through the selectors. And as you can see here, we basically go through activities and we go through their properties. And if we find property called target, then we go through each of the arguments inside target, and we look for argument called selector. And when we find a selector and it isn't empty, then with regular expressions that we have defined here at the beginning of the code, we check for IDX and we check for CSS selectors. And if we do find any, then we create a warning message. We actually have another piece of code that is very similar here, because in some of the activities, the selector is inside a target block, and sometimes there is no target block, there's just a selector. So this is basically the same thing, but it omits the part where you first have to look for a target. I'm not going to be going through all of those rules, but there's one more that I want to show you, and this is about the arguments. And what I think is pretty neat here is that we are looking for certain patterns. So for instance, if we have a variable or an argument that is of type string, then what we say the name should be is it should start with str, then a capital letter, because we're using camel case for variables and arguments, and then a number of letters or numbers. But we do have, because those are our own rules, we do have in reframework certain variables and arguments that have already been created, and we don't want to go through the whole reframework every time we create a new bot and adjust it to our best practices. What's already there, we try not to fiddle with. So we also have an exception list. So there will be variables or arguments called transaction field 1 and 2, transaction ID, orchestrator queue name. They will not be in line with our best practices, but the rule will ignore them. And it's the same thing with booleans. So the should stop and queue retry in reframework that we're gonna ignore. And for data tables, there will be transaction data, settings and contents and assets, and so on and so forth. So those particular cases of variables and arguments will be ignored, even though they do not match our best practices. And another thing that we put in our rules is that we ignore some of the files. So I told you that we prepare test files that are testing our components. And those test files are not a part of the code that will be run in production. And they are kind of quick and dirty files that invoke our component or components with specific arguments. So we do not want those files to be a part of our analysis. And it's the same thing with some of the framework files. Let me show you how we check for them. So for test files, as you can see here, we have a function that checks whether certain file is a test file or not. And basically, if the name of the file contains test, or the folder in which it is stored contains tests, or the name contains sandbox, because we sometimes create files called sandbox just for trying things out for quick and dirty solutions. So those files will not be checked because this is not code that will be run in production. And the same thing with the framework files. So in the framework, there's quite a lot of files that are there and you're using them, but you do not play with them. Very rarely you would edit them. So components like get transaction data or inidle settings or take screenshot, you use them throughout your projects, but usually you do not even look into them. So those files, as they come directly from UiPath, and we know that everything's fine with them, they will also not be checked with our own rules. And this way, as you can see, you can build more and more of those rules. And we already have a few in the pipeline that we are planning to implement. And we are already thinking about what other things we could be checking automatically to make our code better and safer and more robust and more stable. And then when we have the code, you can compile it into a DLL file. And basically, you can just copy this DLL file into your UiPath Studio folder. There's a folder called rules in there, and you can just put this DLL there, and it will show up in your studio. But there are also ways to do this through governance. And I'm not going to go into that. We're not doing it because for now, we are counting on our developers' willingness to use it for their own good. But if you maybe have a very big team or have other reasons, where you really want to make sure that everyone's using the same rules, then you can actually configure it in Orchestrator through an asset. And then everyone will have exactly the same rules. And you can actually force automatic run of the analysis when you are running the code or before the code gets published into your orchestrator. So all of this combined should give you a really good way to keep yourself on your toes, to check your own work. And actually what we are doing now is we are creating a rule for the team, and we are putting in practice a rule for the team that when the developer creates a component and the component is ready, before they send the component to the solution architect, they will check this particular component, because you can filter the analysis for only a particular file. And they will check this and they will see what things they should fix before they send it over. And also the first thing that the solution architect does when they receive a new component from a developer, they will also run analysis on the component. And if they didn't see something that they do not like, they will just send it back for fixing or for explanation why certain thing was left there. I think that's it. So I do hope you can see now how Workflow Analyzer can help you and your team to make better code, to avoid mistakes, to be more in line with development best practices. We will be putting our rules on the marketplace, so you can give it a search for Office Samurai rules. Maybe you can use some of them. One way or another, I wish you all the best. Make the best code you can, and see you around. Thanks. Cheers.